In a remote Amazonian chapel, missionary couple Adam and Rebecca Thornton drank a ceremonial liquid given to them by a tribal elder. Convinced they were achieving a divine transcendence, they arranged their own bodies in a prayer circle to await the end. 4 years later, a scientific expedition broke through the chapel's decaying door and found their skeletons exactly as they had left them, surrounded by hundreds of journal pages documenting their journey from faith to fanaticism. The scene was a perfectly preserved, self-inflicted tragedy. But as the team's local guide stared at a strange hybrid statue behind the remains, he froze in terror. Carved into its base was a symbol he recognized from his grandfather's warnings, the mark of Os Illuminados, a sophisticated and supposedly defunct death cult known for luring outsiders deep into the jungle to become human sacrifices. This wasn't a case of faith gone wrong. The missionaries had been targeted and meticulously groomed for death from the moment they arrived. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. As we dive into this haunting mystery from the depths of the Amazon rainforest, I'd love to know what unsolved disappearances keep you up at night. Share your theories as we unravel this story. You might just see patterns I've missed. And if you're new here, welcome to Last Seen Stories, where we investigate the most perplexing disappearances around the world. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Dr. Lucas Thornton's office at Boston University, casting long shadows across his desk. It was the kind of perfect spring morning that made his students skip class for impromptu frisbee games on the quad. Lucas, however, hadn't noticed the weather. His attention was fixed on the ringing phone, displaying an unfamiliar international number. Something in his gut told him to answer. Something told him it was about Adam. "Dr. Thornton speaking," he said, his voice steady despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "Dr. Thornton, this is Captain Alejandro Diaz with the Brazilian Federal Police." The man's accented English was crisp and formal. "I am calling regarding your brother, Adam Thornton, and his wife, Rebecca." Lucas closed his eyes. 4 years. It had been 4 years since his younger brother and sister-in-law had vanished into the Amazon, their mission work swallowed by the endless green. 4 years of searching, of hope dimming like a candle burning down to its base. "You've found them," Lucas said, not a question. "We believe so, yes. A scientific expedition has discovered remains that may belong to your brother and his wife. We would like you to come to Brazil to assist with identification." Lucas's hand tightened around the phone. "What condition are they in?" A pause. "I think it would be best to discuss the details when you arrive. We can expedite your visa. How soon can you travel to Manaus?" 27 hours later, Lucas stepped off the plane into the humid air of Manaus. The air felt thick enough to swim through, carrying scents of vegetation, river water, and the underlying sweetness of decay that permeated everything in the tropics. Captain Diaz was waiting for him, a stocky man with a close-cropped beard and eyes that had seen too much. He guided Lucas to an air-conditioned SUV, mercifully cool against the oppressive heat. "We'll go directly to meet Dr. Rodriguez," Diaz explained, as they navigated through Manaus's chaotic traffic. She led the expedition that found the site. Lucas nodded, watching the city give way to sprawling favelas at the edges. "When will I see them?" Diaz's eyes flickered to him, then back to the road. "Dr. Rodriguez will explain everything. It's complicated." They pulled up to a modern building housing the regional office of FUNAI, Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency. Inside, they were directed to a conference room where a woman stood studying large photographs pinned to a corkboard. "Dr. Isabella Rodriguez," Diaz introduced. "Dr. Lucas Thornton, Adam's brother." She turned, extending her hand. Mid-40s with intense dark eyes and hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her handshake was firm, her expression somber. "Dr. Thornton, I'm so sorry about your brother and his wife. What we found, it wasn't what any of us expected." Lucas steeled himself. "Please, just tell me what you found." Isabella gestured to a chair. "Perhaps you should sit down." Lucas remained standing. I've spent 4 years imagining every possible scenario. Whatever you found can't be worse than what I've already pictured." Isabella nodded, respecting his choice. "My team was conducting a biological survey approximately 200 kilometers upriver from the last known location of your brother and sister-in-law. We were documenting plant species when one of our guides spotted something unusual, a structure that shouldn't have been there." She turned to the corkboard and pointed to a photograph of a small wooden chapel, weathered but still standing, incongruous against the dense jungle backdrop. This chapel wasn't on any maps. It wasn't near any known settlements. It shouldn't have existed. Isabella paused. "Inside, we found human remains." She moved to another photograph, this one showing the interior of the chapel. Lucas felt his breath catch. In the center of the dirt floor, 2 human skeletons sat facing each other, arranged in a perfect circle. Open Bibles rested on what would have been their laps, skeletal fingers curled around the leather covers. Around them, the walls were covered with pages and pages of handwritten text. "We believe these are the remains of Adam and Rebecca Thornton," Isabella said quietly. "We found identification documents preserved in a waterproof case nearby." Lucas stared at the image, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't a scene of violence or accident. The bodies hadn't been torn apart by animals or scattered by the elements. They had been carefully positioned, as if in prayer. "I don't understand," he said finally. "What happened to them?" Isabella exchanged a glance with Captain Diaz. "That's what we're trying to determine. The positioning of the remains suggests ritual, but whether by their own hands or someone else's, we can't yet say." Lucas felt a cold hollowness spreading through his chest. "I need to see them. Not just photographs. I need to go there." "Dr. Thornton," Captain Diaz began, "the site is extremely remote, and I've funded 4 separate search expeditions into the Amazon over the past 4 years," Lucas cut in. "I'm well aware of the challenges, but I need to see where my brother died. I need to understand." Isabella studied him for a long moment. "It won't be easy," she said finally. "The journey is difficult, and what you'll find there, it may raise more questions than answers." "I've lived with questions for 4 years," Lucas replied. "A few more won't break me." Isabella nodded. "Very well. We can arrange transportation upriver beginning tomorrow. Captain Diaz, can you handle the necessary permissions?" The captain nodded, though his expression suggested he thought this was a bad idea. Lucas turned back to the photographs. "Tell me about the writings on the walls." "Journal entries," Isabella said. "Hundreds of them, dating from shortly after your brother and sister-in-law disappeared to near the end. We've only begun to document them all." "Are they coherent?" Isabella hesitated. "The early ones, yes. The later ones become increasingly disturbed." Lucas swallowed hard, staring at the image of 2 skeletons sitting in eternal prayer. Somewhere in that room were the answers he'd sought for 4 years. He only hoped he could bear to hear them. Adam and Rebecca Thornton had always been devoted to their faith, to each other, and to the calling they felt to spread their message to the furthest corners of the world. Lucas remembered clearly the day in 2005 when Adam had called to tell him about their new assignment. "The upper Amazon basin," Adam had said, excitement evident in his voice despite the poor connection. "There are tribes there that have had almost no contact with the outside world, Lucas. People who have never heard the gospel." Lucas, always the pragmatic older brother, had expressed immediate concern. "That's incredibly dangerous territory, Adam. Disease, hostile tribes, drug traffickers, not to mention the environmental hazards." "That's exactly why we need to go," Rebecca had chimed in, her voice warm and determined. "These people need hope more than anyone." They had been an impressive pair. Adam with his linguistics degree and natural charisma, Rebecca with her nursing background and unshakable calm. Both in their early 30s, they had already completed missionary assignments in Guatemala and Cameroon. The Brazilian Amazon was to be their most challenging post yet. Lucas had followed their preparation with growing unease. They underwent intensive training, jungle survival courses, tropical disease prevention, language study. Their sending organization, Global Faith Ministries, had assigned them to work initially from a small outpost on the Rio Negro, supporting established missions while preparing for deeper ventures into uncontacted territories. For the first 6 months, everything had gone according to plan. Weekly satellite phone calls brought reports of successful medical clinics, language acquisition, and building relationships with local guides. Adam's letters were filled with vivid descriptions of the rainforest and its people, his faith seemingly strengthened by each new challenge. Then came the call that changed everything. "Lucas, we've made contact," Adam had said. His voice barely contained excitement. "A guide introduced us to members of the Yanomara tribe. They've invited us to visit their village. This is unprecedented access. They're eager to hear our message." "That seems unusually receptive," Lucas had replied cautiously. "It's a miracle," Rebecca had interjected. "Their leader, they call him the Elder, speaks some Portuguese. He says they've been waiting for us, Lucas, waiting for our message." That had been their last communication. 3 days later, when they failed to check in at the scheduled time, the mission outpost raised the alarm. A search party found their boat abandoned at a small tributary, their supplies missing. It appeared they had continued on foot, following their guides into the dense jungle. The official search lasted just 2 weeks. The Brazilian authorities, stretched thin across the vast Amazon, concluded that the couple had likely become lost, succumbed to disease, or encountered hostile groups. Their bodies, if they could be found at all, would likely never be recovered from the unforgiving rainforest. Global Faith Ministries had held a memorial service 6 months after their disappearance. Lucas had refused to attend, instead using his own funds to launch private search expeditions. Each one returned empty-handed, the searchers defeated by the sheer vastness of the Amazon and the silence of local tribes, who seemed unwilling to speak of the missing missionaries. After the 3rd failed expedition, even Lucas had begun to accept that his brother might be lost forever. But he had never imagined anything like this: a hidden chapel, a ritual scene, and journal pages that might finally reveal what had happened during those final days. The morning dawned gray and misty as Lucas prepared for the journey upriver. Isabella had assembled a small team: herself, 2 of her original researchers, a local guide named Miguel Torres, and a forensic anthropologist from the University of Sao Paulo who had been called in to examine the remains. Captain Diaz approached as they loaded the boats at the riverside dock. "You understand this is not an official police operation," he said to Lucas. "We've closed the investigation based on Dr. Rodriguez's findings. This is a courtesy to allow you closure." Lucas nodded. "I appreciate that. Whatever you find there," Diaz continued, his voice low, "remember that the jungle changes people. Your brother when he entered may not have been your brother when the end came." Before Lucas could respond, Isabella called him to board the lead boat. They set off into the morning mist, the outboard motors cutting through the glassy surface of the Rio Negro. As the city receded behind them, Lucas felt a growing sense of isolation. The river widened, its black waters stretching like obsidian beneath a canopy of clouds. Isabella sat beside him in the boat, checking equipment. "It will take us 2 days to reach the site," she explained. "We'll camp overnight at a research station about halfway." "Tell me more about what you found," Lucas said. "The journals, what did they say?" Isabella hesitated. "We've only documented about 1/3 of the entries. They start chronologically, describing their journey to meet the Yanomara tribe. The early entries are hopeful. Adam writes about their welcome, about the tribe's unexpected receptiveness to their message. And later? Later, the tone changes. He begins describing unusual tribal customs, ceremonies involving substances we believe were hallucinogens. Rebecca appears to have fallen ill. The entries become more fragmented, more mystical. Lucas stared out at the passing shoreline, dense with vegetation. "My brother wasn't easily influenced. He was educated, rational, despite his faith. "The jungle has its own logic," Isabella said softly, echoing Diaz's warning. "Isolation, unfamiliar surroundings, perhaps illness, they can change one's perception of reality." They traveled in silence after that, the drone of the motor and the occasional call of birds the only sounds. As they penetrated deeper into the rainforest, the river narrowed and the vegetation pressed closer. Massive trees draped with vines created a living tunnel, dappled sunlight filtering through in shifting patterns. By late afternoon, they reached the research station, a collection of simple wooden structures on stilts near the riverbank. After securing the boats, they gathered in the main building for a simple meal of rice, beans, and fish. As night fell, the sounds of the jungle intensified, a symphony of insects, frogs, and nocturnal birds creating a wall of noise that seemed to press against the thin walls of the station. Lucas sat on the porch, listening, trying to imagine his brother experiencing these same sounds, this same isolation. Miguel, the guide, joined him, offering a cup of coffee. "You should rest, Dr. Thornton. Tomorrow we leave the main river. The journey becomes more difficult." Lucas accepted the coffee. "Did you know this region when my brother disappeared?" Miguel nodded slowly. "I guided one of your search parties 3 years ago." "I remember now," Lucas said. "You were skeptical about the Yanamara tribe." "Because there is no Yanamara tribe," Miguel said quietly, "not as a distinct people. There are many small groups in this region, some related to the Yanomami, others to the Ticuna, but no tribe calls themselves Yanamara." Lucas felt a chill despite the humid night. Then who were they meeting? Miguel shrugged. "There are stories of groups that broke away from their tribes, of mixed communities that follow neither traditional ways nor the ways of the city. Some say they have created their own beliefs, taking pieces from many traditions." "Cults?" Lucas said flatly. "Perhaps, or simply people trying to survive in their own way." Miguel rose to his feet. "You should sleep, Dr. Thornton. Tomorrow will be long." The next day brought narrower waterways, the boats now navigating shallow tributaries where fallen trees and sandbars created constant obstacles. By midday, they were forced to continue on foot, hiking through dense undergrowth that seemed to close behind them as they passed. The humidity was suffocating, clothes clinging to skin, every breath an effort. Lucas felt disoriented by the sameness of the surroundings, endless green, the absence of horizon, the filtered light creating a timeless quality where morning and afternoon became indistinguishable. "How much further?" he asked as they paused to rest. "Another hour," Isabella replied, consulting her GPS. "The chapel is built on a small rise, one of the few elevated areas in this floodplain." They continued in single file, Miguel leading the way, machete in hand to clear the denser sections of undergrowth. Gradually, the forest began to thin, and the ground rose slightly beneath their feet. "There," Miguel said, pointing ahead. The chapel appeared suddenly, as if materializing from the jungle itself. A simple wooden structure with a pitched roof and a small cross at the peak. Vines had begun to claim the walls, but the building remained largely intact, protected somewhat by the canopy of trees above it. Lucas felt his heart pounding as they approached. The door hung partially open, swollen with moisture and listing on rusted hinges. Isabella placed a hand on his arm. "Are you ready for this?" He nodded, unable to speak. 4 years of searching, of wondering, had led to this moment. Whatever waited inside, he would face it. The interior was dim, shafts of sunlight penetrating through gaps in the wooden walls and illuminating swirling dust motes. The smell hit him first, musty, organic, the scent of decay held in suspension. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, the scene from the photographs took shape before him. In the center of the dirt floor, 2 skeletons sat facing each other, their bones a pale ivory against the dark earth. They had been arranged with care, legs crossed in meditative posture, spines straight, skulls tilted slightly forward as if in prayer. Between them, open Bibles lay where hands had once held them. And surrounding this macabre tableau, covering nearly every inch of wall space, were pages and pages of handwritten text. Lucas moved forward slowly, as if in a trance. He knelt beside the smaller skeleton, Rebecca, he presumed, and looked into the empty eye sockets of what had once been his sister-in-law's face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. The forensic anthropologist moved carefully around the remains, taking photographs and measurements without disturbing the arrangement. Isabella approached one of the walls, gently touching one of the pages. "The earliest entries are here," she said. "They follow a chronological path around the room, like a timeline." Lucas rose and joined her, studying the faded handwriting. He recognized it immediately, Adam's neat, precise script, though the early entries showed none of the deterioration evident in the later pages. "May 12, 2006, he read aloud. "We've made contact with the Yanamara people. Our guide, Tomas, introduced us to 3 men from the tribe who were fishing along the tributary. They invited us to visit their village, which they say is a 3-day journey on foot from the river. Rebecca and I spent the evening in prayer, seeking guidance. We feel strongly that this is the opportunity we've been waiting for. We will go with them tomorrow." Lucas moved to the next page. "May 15, 2006. We've reached the Yanamara village after an arduous journey. The terrain was challenging, but our guides were patient and helpful. The village is unlike any indigenous settlement I've seen before, more organized, with structures that show influence from outside their traditional culture. They've built a central meeting house that resembles a chapel, with benches arranged in rows. The elder, as they call their leader, greeted us warmly. He speaks Portuguese well, which is unexpected this deep in the territory. He told us they have been waiting for teachers like us. I cannot help but feel God's hand in this extraordinary welcome." The entries continued, describing the first weeks among the tribe. Adam wrote of daily gatherings where he and Rebecca shared Bible stories, of children eager to learn English words, of medical clinics Rebecca established to treat minor ailments. The tone was one of excitement and gratitude, a missionary's dream of receptive hearts and minds. "This doesn't make sense," Lucas said, turning to Isabella. "If they were so welcomed, what went wrong?" "Keep reading," she replied softly. "The change happens gradually." Lucas moved along the wall, following the progression of dates. Around mid-June, the entries began to shift subtly. June 18, 2006. "The elder invited us to observe a special ceremony tonight. He said it would help us understand their spiritual beliefs better, allowing us to find common ground between their traditions and our teachings. Rebecca was hesitant, but I feel we must show respect for their customs if we hope to truly connect with them. The ceremony involved a drink made from local plants. The elder said it would open our eyes to the truth. Out of respect, we took small sips only. The effects were disorienting. Colors became more vivid, sounds more intense. The tribe performed dances that seemed to tell a story of creation not unlike Genesis, though with significant differences. I found myself moved to tears by the beauty of it. Rebecca retired early, saying she felt unwell. The next entry showed a slight deterioration in Adam's handwriting. June 20, 2006. Rebecca has been ill since the ceremony. Fever, disorientation. I've been treating her with our medical supplies, but she's not improving as quickly as I'd expect. The elder brought medicines from their shaman, teas and poultices that seem to help somewhat. He sits with us for hours, teaching me their language and explaining their beliefs. There are surprising parallels to Christianity. A great spirit who sacrificed for his people, redemption through transformation, eternal life through sacred communion. I'm beginning to think these people have somehow retained elements of earlier missionary contact, perhaps from centuries ago, woven into their own traditions. This could explain their receptiveness to our message. Lucas continued reading, a growing sense of unease building within him. The entries through July described Rebecca's cycling health, periods of improvement followed by relapses. Adam wrote of deepening relationships with the tribe, particularly the elder, who seemed to spend more and more time with them. By August, the tone had shifted dramatically. August 3, 2006. The elder revealed something extraordinary today. He believes their people and ours share the same God, merely understood through different perspectives. He showed me ancient texts they've preserved, fragments of what appear to be a Bible, though heavily annotated with their own interpretations. Rebecca remains skeptical, but I find myself increasingly drawn to their syncretic approach. The boundaries between our faiths seem more permeable than I once believed. Last night's ceremony brought visions of such clarity. I saw the face of Christ, but he spoke in the Yanamara tongue. Miguel, who had been examining the chapel structure, approached quietly. "Dr. Thornton, you should see this." He led Lucas to a small alcove behind what would have been an altar area. There, partially hidden by fallen timbers, stood a statue. Not the expected crucifix, but a strange hybrid figure, part Christ on the cross, part indigenous deity, adorned with feathers and painted symbols. "This is not traditional for any tribe I know," Miguel said, his voice low. "This is something new." Lucas stared at the statue, its features seeming to shift in the dim light. He returned to the wall of journals, now moving more quickly through the entries. Adam's handwriting had become increasingly erratic, the content more disjointed. Rebecca appeared less frequently in the accounts, mentioned mainly in reference to her ongoing illness and growing concerns. September 12, 2006. Rebecca doesn't understand what's happening here. She sees only danger where I see revelation. Last night she tried to convince me we should leave, return to the mission base. She doesn't see that we've been led here for a purpose greater than we imagined. The elder says she's fighting the transformation, that her illness is the natural resistance of her body to spiritual awakening. I've convinced her to stay one more week. The sacred ceremony is approaching, the culmination of all we've been learning. I believe it will heal her doubts as it has healed mine. The forensic anthropologist approached, clipboard in hand. "Dr. Rodriguez, I've completed my preliminary examination." Isabella turned to him. "What can you tell us?" "The remains are consistent with a male and female, both in their early 30s. No obvious signs of trauma to the bones. The positioning appears to have been arranged post-mortem, but not long after death. Without further analysis, I can't determine cause of death." "Could it have been suicide?" Lucas asked, the word bitter in his mouth. The anthropologist hesitated. "It's possible. There are empty containers among the artifacts that could have held poison, but I'd need toxicology tests to confirm." Lucas turned back to the wall, scanning for the final entries. The last dated page was from October 2006, the handwriting now barely recognizable as Adam's. October 21, 2006. "The time has come. The elder says we are ready for the final communion, the transcendence through sacred surrender. Rebecca has finally seen the truth. Last night's vision united us in understanding. We have built this chapel with our own hands, creating a sacred space where worlds meet. Our journals will remain as testament to the journey. Our bodies will be vessels of prayer, our spirits freed to join the great unity the elder has revealed to us. We go with joy into this transformation, grateful for the path that led us here. If you are reading this, know that we were not lost, but found." Lucas stared at the final entry, then at the skeletal figures arranged in their eternal prayer circle. A wave of nausea swept through him. This couldn't be Adam, rational, thoughtful Adam, who had debated theology with him late into the night during college, who had approached his faith with intellectual rigor alongside emotional commitment. "We need to take samples," Isabella said gently. "Hair, bone, anything that might tell us if they were drugged." Lucas nodded numbly. "Take whatever you need." As the team worked carefully around the remains, Lucas continued studying the journal entries, looking for any clue that might explain this transformation. What had happened to the tribe? Why had they left Adam and Rebecca here, in this remote chapel? "Dr. Rodriguez," Miguel called from outside, "you should see this." They joined him at the rear of the chapel, where he pointed to a narrow trail leading deeper into the jungle. "This path has been maintained," Someone still comes here. Isabella frowned. Recently? Within the past month, I would say. Miguel knelt, examining broken vegetation. Multiple people. The tribe? Lucas asked. Miguel shook his head. I don't know, but someone remembers this place. A plan began to form in Lucas's mind. I want to find them, whoever they are. They might have answers. Isabella looked concerned. That wasn't part of our mission here. We came to document the site and recover the remains if you wished. I need to understand what happened, Lucas insisted. If there's a settlement nearby, people who knew Adam and Rebecca, I have to speak with them. Miguel exchanged glances with Isabella. It would be risky. We don't know who maintains this path or why they visit the chapel. I'll pay you, Lucas said, whatever it takes. But I didn't come this far to leave with more questions than answers. After some discussion, they agreed to a compromise. They would complete their documentation of the chapel, collecting samples for analysis and carefully preserving the journal pages. Lucas would return to Manaus with the forensic anthropologist, while Isabella, Miguel, and one researcher would follow the path to look for settlements, returning to the research station within 3 days. As they prepared to leave, Lucas took one final look at the skeletal remains of his brother and sister-in-law. The forensic anthropologist had collected samples but left the arrangement undisturbed, respecting what appeared to be their final wishes. Should we bury them? Lucas asked. Isabella considered. That's your decision, but it might be better to wait until we know more. If there is a local community connected to them, they might have their own wishes to consider. Lucas nodded, though the thought of leaving them exposed in this chapel felt wrong. Still, disturbing what might have been a deliberate ritual arrangement seemed equally problematic. We'll wait, he decided, but not long. They sealed the chapel door as best they could and marked the GPS coordinates. The return journey seemed faster somehow, the weight of discovery propelling them through the dense jungle and back to the boats. That night at the research station, Lucas couldn't sleep. He sat reviewing photographs of the journal pages on Isabella's laptop, trying to trace the progression of his brother's transformation. What had started as enthusiastic missionary work had somehow morphed into something unrecognizable, a syncretic spiritual journey that had ended in apparent ritual suicide. The next morning, Lucas and the anthropologist departed from Manaus, while Isabella's team prepared to follow the mysterious path. They agreed to reconvene in 3 days, whether or not the search proved fruitful. Back in the city, Lucas found himself adrift, waiting for news while preliminary lab work began on the samples they'd collected. Captain Diaz arranged for him to stay at a comfortable hotel near the Funai offices, where he spent hours poring over copies of the journal entries, looking for any detail he might have missed. On his second evening in Manaus, he received an unexpected visitor. An elderly Brazilian man in simple clothes arrived at his hotel, introduced by Diaz as Dr. Paulo Fernandes, a retired anthropologist who had spent decades studying indigenous communities in the Amazon. Captain Diaz told me about your discovery, Dr. Fernandes said as they sat in the hotel restaurant. The description sounded familiar to me. Lucas leaned forward. You've heard of something like this before? Fernandes nodded slowly. Not exactly the same, but similar elements. In the 1970s, I documented a phenomenon occurring in certain remote areas, the formation of what you might call hybrid spiritual communities. Cults, Lucas said. That term carries judgments, Fernandes replied. But yes, in essence, these groups typically formed around a charismatic leader, often someone who had experience with both indigenous traditions and outside religions. They would attract followers from various tribes, particularly those whose traditional structures had been disrupted by outside forces, logging, mining, disease. And they incorporated Christian elements? Sometimes. Christianity has penetrated the Amazon for centuries, though often in fragmented or distorted forms. What made these groups particularly dangerous was their use of traditional plant medicines, ayahuasca, toh, various tropane alkaloids, not in the controlled, ritualistic manner of traditional shamanism, but in increasingly extreme ways to induce what they considered spiritual transformation. Lucas pulled out his tablet, showing Fernandez photographs of the chapel and the strange hybrid statue. The old anthropologist studied them with a troubled expression. "This is more sophisticated than what I documented. The syncretism is more deliberate. This was not a naive blending, but a calculated reconstruction of spiritual elements." "Do you recognize the symbol carved on the base of the statue?" Lucas asked, zooming in on a distinctive marking. Fernandez adjusted his glasses. "Yes, it belongs to a group that called themselves Os Iluminados, the Enlightened Ones. They were active in the 1980s and 1990s, led by a man who had been both a Catholic seminarian and an apprentice to an indigenous shaman. They believed they were creating a universal spiritual path that transcended cultural boundaries. What happened to them? They withdrew deeper into the jungle after authorities investigated several deaths associated with their ceremonies. I thought they had disbanded, but this," he gestured to the photographs, "this suggests they continued, perhaps reformed under new leadership." Lucas felt a chill. The elder? Possibly. Their leader was known for recruiting outsiders, anthropologists, missionaries, anyone who showed interest in indigenous spirituality. He was particularly drawn to those with religious training. "Like my brother," Lucas said quietly. "The pattern was always the same," Fernandez continued. "Warm welcome, gradual introduction to their syncretic practices, carefully escalating use of hallucinogenic substances, and eventually, for the most dedicated, a final ritual they called a transcendenza, the transcendence. Suicide." Fernandez nodded grimly. "But they wouldn't have seen it that way. In their belief system, it was a conscious, joyful passage to a higher spiritual plane." Lucas thought of Adam's final journal entry, the talk of sacred surrender and transcendence. The words matched Fernandez's description with chilling precision. "Dr. Fernandez, I need to know, was my brother murdered or did he choose this?" The old anthropologist sighed. "The line between coercion and choice becomes blurred in such environments. Isolation, psychological manipulation, powerful hallucinogens, these can transform one's perception of reality. Your brother and his wife may have believed they were making a sacred choice, but they were almost certainly under the influence of both psychological manipulation and powerful psychoactive substances." Lucas struggled to process this information. "My team is looking for their settlement now. If they find it—" "They should be extremely cautious," Fernandez warned. "These groups are highly protective of their isolation, and if they're still practicing these rituals—" Lucas's phone rang, Isabella's number. He excused himself to answer. "Lucas," her voice was breathless, urgent. "We found them, a settlement about 4 kilometers from the chapel. But something's wrong. They saw us before we could withdraw. Miguel says we need to leave immediately." "Are you in danger?" Lucas asked, his heart racing. "I don't know. They didn't seem hostile, just watchful. But Miguel is insistent. He recognized something. Symbols, faces, I'm not sure. We're heading back to the boats now." "Be careful," Lucas urged. "I've learned more about them here. They may be more dangerous than we realized." The line went silent for a moment. When Isabella spoke again, her voice was lower, tense. "Someone's following us. I have to go." The call ended. Lucas stared at the phone, then at Fernandez, who had overheard enough to understand the situation. "Call Captain Diaz," the anthropologist advised. "They may need assistance." The next 24 hours passed in agonizing suspense. Diaz arranged for a police helicopter to fly to the research station, but by the time it arrived, Isabella and her team had returned safely. They reported being followed through the jungle, but not directly confronted. Miguel had insisted on traveling through the night, taking no chances with their pursuers. When they returned to Manaus the following day, Isabella brought photographs and recordings from the settlement they'd discovered, a collection of structures that blended indigenous architecture with outside influences, housing perhaps 50 people of mixed tribal origins. At the center stood a larger building similar to the chapel where Adam and Rebecca had died. "They were watching us from the moment we approached," Isabella explained as they reviewed the materials. "Not hiding, not threatening, just observing. I felt like they were deciding something." Miguel, his normally calm demeanor visibly shaken, pointed to figures in the photographs. I recognized some of them, men who visit river towns occasionally to trade. They're known for being secretive, keeping to themselves. There are stories. Os Iluminados, Lucas said, explaining what he had learned from Dr. Fernandez. Miguel nodded. That name. My grandfather spoke of them. He warned never to accept food or drink from them, never to follow them into the forest. The preliminary toxicology results arrived that afternoon, confirming what they had begun to suspect. Hair samples from both sets of remains showed high levels of DMT, scopolamine, and several unidentified alkaloids consistent with powerful hallucinogenic plants native to the Amazon. The combination and concentration of these substances would have caused intense hallucinations, suggestibility, and eventually respiratory depression. Death would have been relatively peaceful, more like falling into a deep sleep than suffering. Lucas tried to take comfort in that, at least. Whatever had led to their final moments, Adam and Rebecca hadn't suffered physically. But the psychological journey that had brought them to that point, from devoted missionaries to participants in a syncretic death ritual, remained difficult to comprehend. Captain Diaz arranged a meeting with regional authorities to determine next steps. The existence of Os Iluminados and their apparent continuation of dangerous ritual practices warranted investigation, but jurisdiction in remote indigenous territories was complicated by Brazilian law, which granted certain autonomies to tribal communities. We can open an investigation based on the evidence of induced suicide, Diaz explained, but prosecuting anyone would be extremely difficult without clear evidence of coercion. What about the others? Lucas asked. Dr. Fernandez mentioned other deaths associated with this group. Diaz nodded grimly. We're reviewing cold cases with similar elements. There are at least 3 other disappearances in the past decade that match this pattern, outsiders who ventured into the region and never returned. Lucas made his decision. I want to recover my brother and sister-in-law's remains. They deserve a proper burial, whatever they believed at the end. The recovery operation was organized quickly, with Captain Diaz providing a police escort this time. They returned to the chapel and, carefully, respectfully, collected the skeletal remains, preserving the arrangement for documentation before placing them in appropriate containers for transport. Lucas insisted on preserving all the journal pages as well. These are the last words of my brother. Whatever they reveal about his state of mind, they're important to understanding what happened. As they prepared to leave, Lucas noticed Miguel standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dense undergrowth. Following his gaze, Lucas caught a flash of movement, a face, perhaps, watching from the shadows, then gone. They're still watching, Miguel said quietly. Let them watch, Lucas replied. We're taking my family home. The journey back to Boston with his brother and sister-in-law's remains was a somber one. Lucas had arranged for private funeral services, attended only by close family and friends who had known Adam and Rebecca before their faithful mission. He struggled with how to explain what had happened, settling finally on a simplified version that emphasized their dedication while acknowledging that they had been influenced by extreme circumstances. In the months that followed, Lucas immersed himself in understanding what had happened to Adam and Rebecca. He worked with experts in cult psychology, anthropologists specializing in syncretic religious movements, and researchers studying the effects of traditional plant medicines. Gradually, he came to accept that his brother's transformation had been the result of a perfect storm: isolation, cultural disorientation, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and powerful psychoactive substances that had literally altered his brain chemistry. A year after recovering Adam and Rebecca's remains, Lucas established the Thornton Foundation for Religious Freedom and Safety, dedicated to educating missionary organizations about the dangers of isolation and psychological manipulation. He developed training programs that helped prepare religious workers to recognize warning signs of undue influence while still respecting indigenous traditions. The Brazilian authorities eventually launched a full investigation into Os Iluminados, though their findings remained classified. Captain Diaz informed Lucas only that several other cases had been linked to the group, and that steps were being taken to monitor their activities without directly interfering with their community, a delicate balance reflecting Brazil's complex approach to indigenous autonomy. On the anniversary of bringing Adam and Rebecca home, Lucas visited their graves in the small cemetery where generations of Thorntons had been laid to rest.
The autumn leaves were turning, creating a tapestry of gold and crimson against the gray stones. He placed fresh flowers between their markers and stood in silent contemplation. The peaceful cemetery seemed worlds away from the remote jungle chapel where they had spent their final days. Yet in both places there was a profound silence, a sense of boundaries between worlds, life and death, reason and faith, the known and the unknowable. "I understand better now," Lucas said softly to the granite markers. "Not completely, perhaps, never completely, but enough to find some peace with it." In his briefcase was a bound volume, a complete transcription of Adam's journals, which Lucas had spent months organizing and annotating. Reading them chronologically, with the benefit of expert consultation, had revealed the subtle progression of influence. What had begun as cultural respect had become participation. What had started as theological curiosity had transformed into syncretic belief. What had been missionary zeal had morphed into mystical conviction. The human mind, Lucas had learned, was both remarkably resilient and surprisingly fragile. The right combination of isolation, suggestion, and chemical influence could transform even the most grounded individual. Adam and Rebecca hadn't been weak or foolish. They had been systematically drawn into a reality constructed by others. Their perception altered step by step until the unthinkable became not only thinkable but desirable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Lucas felt a sense of completion, of questions answered as fully as they could be. The mystery that had consumed him for years had revealed its secrets, though the revelation brought grief rather than satisfaction. He turned to leave, then paused, remembering something from one of Adam's final journal entries. "In the end, we are all seeking connection. To each other, to meaning, to something greater than ourselves. The paths we choose matter less than the love that guides us along them." Whatever else had happened in that remote chapel, Lucas believed that Adam and Rebecca had acted out of love, for each other, for their faith, for the connection they believed they had found. Manipulated and altered though that belief had been, the core of who they were, their goodness, their devotion, their humanity, remained intact in Lucas's memory. And that, perhaps, was the most important truth to preserve. Isolation and manipulation can transform even the most devout individuals, changing their perception of reality until the unthinkable becomes not only acceptable, but embraced. The investigation into Os Iluminados continues, with authorities monitoring for signs of other vulnerable outsiders being drawn into their community. 3 additional missing persons cases with similar patterns have been reopened, though locating remains in the vast Amazon remains challenging. The Thornton Foundation now works with over 50 missionary organizations worldwide, providing training and support systems designed to prevent isolation and recognize warning signs of undue influence. Their work has potentially saved countless lives, creating a legacy of awareness from tragedy. What happened to Adam and Rebecca Thornton serves as a powerful reminder of human vulnerability, how our search for meaning and connection can be exploited, how the line between devotion and destruction can blur under the right circumstances. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to Last Seen Stories for more in-depth explorations of mysterious disappearances. Share your theories about what really happened to Adam and Rebecca in the comments below. Do you think they were fully manipulated, or was there an element of choice in their final actions? What other cases of religious manipulation have you encountered? Next week, we'll explore the disappearance of a family of 5 from their isolated mountain cabin and the shocking discovery made when a hiker sought shelter during an unexpected blizzard 7 years later.